well, Mrs. Paul, actually, that's more part of your research than mine, but because what I meant was mostly about 1990s and later decades where, for example, the MFL was used to it was more strictly enforced to get first wife's permission for marrying the second one, because of course in the earlier decades it was quite a common practice that, for example, the first wife's signature was obtained at the sheet of paper while she wasn't even able to read, or even this signature was falsified on, or so on, while at the contemporary times the line of verdicts was more that this should be this should be confirmed by some better way, some way which can be proved in court in case of something. It was also more strictly enforced to sign nikahnama or marriage contracts in a way specified by the MFLO, which was quite rare at the first decade after its promulgation, and so on.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, as we can say that yes, regardless this many issues which are related to Muslim family law ordinance, you know, starting from as you mentioned, legal grounds of starting from the validity of the law. We can still say that, you know, this law is till now on, of course, is used as a tool to empower women, and based on this law, women maybe not they didn't get right because those rights are already given them in Islamic law. But yes, I mean, for sure, we can say that this law, even if it's not the perfect law, it's still being used as a tool to empower women. So that's our question. Now, Dr. Zuber.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think it was fascinating, the details, the history, and specifically, I think most interesting for me was that most of the women, they were second wives themselves, and then it was kind of quite hypocritic, if I may say so, on their part, that they were trying to regulate polygamy while they themselves were the second and the more gorgeous and the more educated wives themselves. So that was fascinating. So Professor, I just want to ask you that if the main attack on MFLO is that it had democracy deficit, so the main attack on this by ulama, what I understand from your discussion is that, look, although the act was good, but the way it was promulgated, it was not democratic. And then you made very nice connection with Musharraf, that when Musharraf in 2006 promulgated Protection of Women's Act 2006 by trying to reform Hudud ordinances. So there is kind of parallel. And this is the critique of Western feminism, that Western feminism, although they talk about rights, and some critics say that, but they literally sleep with the dictators, right? So would you elaborate that point a bit further?
Okay, but just a bit. So there is a very famous scholar who wrote a very big book about Pakistan's economy, Syed Akbar Zaidi, and there he put quite a big, I guess at least a whole page about Musharraf's takeover, where he wrote something like this: the modernist part of the Pakistani society was so happy, and what we could call an Islamic citizen society was against. Now what happens here? The Western conceptions, the Western ideas of the citizen society says that it's naturally inclined to democracy because they don't want to be controlled too much by the state. Well, the Pakistan is not like this. In the Pakistan, the main line is conservatives versus modernists, and whether those purposes, those will be furthered by a democratic regime or undemocratic regime is meaningless. Well, that may have been true at the times of Musharraf. At the times of Ayub Khan, the main lines were a bit different, if only because the religious, the fundamentalists were not such a power. There were no terrorism and so on. But still, it is quite a misfortune that the most, let's say, modern reforms were associated with the dictators. I like to bring the example of abortion in Poland. So it was legalized by communists in 1955, as I said, and of course at the communism there was no social debate about it. So when the Poland regained its independence, in just 3 years, in 1993, the parliament effectively delegalized abortion, and to date it wasn't rectified. And what helped to delegalize abortion was partly the way it was introduced. It was said that abortion was introduced by communists, and communists are our enemies, who are servants of Russia, who wanted to do bad to our nation. So that's what happens. Let's compare the US, where abortion was legalized by Supreme Court, and from that time the conservatives are dreaming, now let's regain Supreme Court, and lo and behold, we can overturn Roe contra Wade. And then let's compare the Italy, which was which half a century ago was as religious country as Poland later, and yet the legal abortion was brought in a in a popular referendum in 1970s. I don't remember the exact year, and no one ever later tried to overturn it, even when religion got more meaning at the end of the century with Pope John Paul II. So I guess that's the lesson here. The more democratic legitimacy certain laws have, the harder it is then to overturn them or delegitimize them, because it cannot be said that someone came and just pushed us into it. So I guess that's a good lesson. But of course, here we are getting into the question of legitimacy of democratic process in Pakistan, with army meddling, judges meddling, and other factors meddling. But of course, that's a vast topic about which we could talk by a week and not at this short debate.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. And I think I really admired the way you just link the debates around MFLO with these global debates about this pro-life and pro-choice debate. Here, I just want to ask you some questions about your journey as a scholar, as a researcher. So, what was the motivation for you to undertake this research?
Thank you. So, first of all, it was like this. During my historical studies, I became interested in colonial Bengal. My MA was about the examples of famines at the Indian subcontinent at 20th century. My PhD was about the political and social life in Bengal in 1945 to 1947. And after this, I began to write a synthesis of Pakistan's history up to 1977, up to Zulfikar Bhutto's overthrow. And when collecting the literature, it struck me that the social history of Pakistan is the most under-researched of it all. And the women's studies into which I were exposed at the Institute of History in Poland, with which I'm affiliated, seemed interesting. Actually, some of my good friends are women's scholars themselves, and the research apparatus they developed could be useful here, but also it's a topic which can interest more people than let's say a purely economic history, while the political history is well researched by itself. I also linked it with other problems which are under research, considering the social history of Pakistan at this time. Just last week, I was reading a PhD by Leili Udin, who wrote it last decade at the Royal Holloway in London, and she wrote a most important phrase that when she looked into the works about East Pakistan, which were published in last 2 decades, she found exactly 2 books about the 24 years the 24 years under Pakistan's rule, but 5 books about the Mukti Judh, the War of Liberation in 1971, whatever it's called in Pakistan. So seems like the juicy topics like wars or political coups or things like this take the most of people's attention, while social history, I guess if I began to number the Pakistani historians which are working on it, I don't know if I would need only my hands to count the fingers of my hands, or if I could use also toes. But most of them are concentrated in the Lahore School of Management and Sciences, and it's concentrated, let's face it, on the leftists' agenda of researching the workers and the peasants, which is of course laudable all by itself. I would describe my own worldview as a leftist liberal, but there's still other angles by which we can look into the social history of that time, including, of course, oral history. Oral history was at times used here, but I don't know of any example of it being used to research a woman's history of Pakistan and Bangladesh for pre-Zia times, unless it was about obviously war, one war or other war or partition. So I guess that would be the last moment to find the women workers from that time, and actually women who remember 1960s and 1970s from the out, and ask them about confirmation or rejection of the hypothesis we are putting here about, for example, how the second marriages looked or how was MFLO received, until before it will be too late.
I think this is an excellent proposal that we need to do oral history. But as you mentioned that it was more discussed about, but it did not really trickle down, specifically when it came to villages. So there we saw that when Zia-ul-Haq introduced Hudud laws, there we see that when marriages were not registered and divorces were not registered, and then women were actually prosecuted for extramarital sex. So there we see the example that although there was lots of discussion about MFLO, how it was politically charged, but when it comes to its actual implementation or its practice, it was quite minimal. So that's excellent point. Another question that I want to ask you is that now that 60 years have passed MFLO, so where do you see, and perhaps more important in your presentation, um, uh, an objection should be raised that you basically seem to be an apologist for the ulama. So definitely the current debate is set that, oh, these were modernist politicians, specifically Ayub Khan, who wanted to reform Islam. And look, these ulama, Jamaat-e-Islami and Deobandis, everyone, they were against women's rights. So the story you're telling is that actually it was much more complicated. But it could be said that you are basically trying to be an apologist for the ulama. Is that true?
Me, I don't consider myself an apologist for the ulama because some of them because the vision of family they are proposing is quite unacceptable for me personally. But first of all, I think they deserve to be heard and to be analyzed in a dispassionate way, while in a discourse which is not religiously linked, they are often seen as, well, backward mullahs. It's not only because some of the reasoning they made was genuinely witty. I remember one Jamaat-e-Islami high-ranked worker who invoked the famous Kinsey report as a and he said that Kinsey report is an argument for early marriages. Why? Because Kinsey report says that teenagers have a lot of sex. So if they would have sex anyway, now wouldn't it be better for them to do it in lawful marriage union? But even apart from that, I still believe that in ulama of 1950s and 1960s, even there were a bit more than meets an eye. It's not that they weren't often backward people who proposed things which may be unacceptable for us, like an exclusion of Ahmadis. But here, the other side just rejected any idea of debating with them. It's really not a coincidence that famous Judge Muhammad Munir, who was author of famous Munir report, where the anti-Ahmadi riots in 1953 were condemned and ulama show as a bunch of pitiful, quarrelsome guys. So it's the same Judge Munir who then legitimized Ayub Khan's coup and takeover in famous Dosso case. It's even in famous Munir report, which now is hailed as a way to defend Ahmadis against bigotry. We find there the Judge Munir outwardly says that democracy where the politicians do what people want them to do is not right, because people are backward and generally unenlightened, and they don't want and they don't know what is good for them. So what polity would be better? So the Judge Munir quotes the chief of police in Punjab, who says that a good politician is the one who can lead the herd. Now, seriously, Pakistan, I guess, would have far less problems if it had let people decide a few things. and there ulama would have only as much ulama would be heard only as much as they were be able to convince people, while when they are suppressed, when they are excluded from democratic debate just because they are backward, they may present themselves as a martyrs excluded by establishment. And what's worse, there's a grain of truth in it. As long as we want to be honest, we cannot stop to hear what they have to say, which doesn't mean that we have to obey. It was well summed up by a scholar, Harun Ullah, who analyzed the behavior of Jamaat Islami and other Islamic parties when they actually were elected somewhere at the first decades of 21st century. And he concluded that when they are elected, they quite well fit into what democratic policy requires from them. And he also remarked that even Jamaat Islami at the end turned against General Zia because his repressive rule was too much even for them. Of course, autocrats always want to control every sphere. That would be too much for ulama. So Ullah concluded that in that case, maybe we should not fear so much to let ulama participate in democratic debate. Whom we should fear first are the ones who want to exclude ulama or actually anyone else from the democratic process, because that invariably leads to even worse leads to even worse situations. Thank you.
Professor Felicensky, you are raising so many interesting points. I think I would like to continue this discussion, but one of the perplexing issues that I, as a legal historian, find it difficult to comprehend is the attitude of ulama towards women's rights. So during colonial period, we know that ulama got passed two legislations, Shariat Application Act 1937 and Dissolution of Muslim Marriages Act 1939. And both were framed in the language of protection of women's rights. First, inheritance right, and second, right to divorce. But when Pakistan is created, the same ulama, they are against any intervention of the state for protection of women. So how do we explain this contrast, pre-colonial ulama and post-colonial ulama?
Unexpected question, but I can put some hypotheses. First of all, when the ulama fought for those things in 1930s, they were underlining that all the Muslims in British India are Muslims, and they should be governed by what Shariat proves to them, which for example means that women should get half of men are getting, while the custom was that they mostly get nothing at all. Matthew Nelson, another important scholar which should be invoked here, saw it as a fight by city against village, considering that the symbolical village, which was of course in fact more than a village, was a stronghold of custom, which ignored the stipulations of Islam as long as it suited. That was one thing. Another thing was that British India are governed by British, and ulama have to, as they say, cut their losses. So, for example, this dissolution of the Muslim Marriage Act was partly motivated by the fact that some Muslim women were so desperate to get rid of their husbands that they were they even agreed to convert to Christianity, to be converted to Christianity or something else, just to get rid of them, because of course that resulted in the marriage being cancelled. So Maududi or other ulama say, no, let's just give them some way to dissolve marriage when they cannot bear it. But for God's sake, let's not make them renounce their faith, because that would be awful. So here we can find the pattern. Also, it may even be argued that later during General Zia's times, it repeats itself just a bit, because for example, some of ulama who helped draft hudud decrees seems like they were genuinely thinking that they are helping women, because they only have for them what Sharia prescribes, and at the same time the local custom is strongly discouraged. For example, as we remember, we need 4 male witnesses to prove adultery, and considering that during Pashtuns it only took a gossip to treat adultery as proven, it can be said that it's just a little progress. Of course, what was the real outcome of hudud decrees we all know, so we don't need to repeat that. The real consequences were worse, but that's how it seems. There's one more thing. Of course, women themselves at the end of the British rule found the unwanted or sometimes wanted allies of ulama, considering, as I said before, that Sharia would guarantee for them half of the inheritance and the custom would get nothing for them. And the research of Stephen Leon, who 2 years ago published a very interesting book about changes of family in Pakistan, shows that only now it has begun trickling down, that now even in the villages, even in conservative zamindar families, women at times are asking for the inheritance, while 2 generations ago they would have not thought of it. Even the old aunts or old unmarried sisters who did not get their inheritance at let's say 40 years ago, now they are claiming for it. So it took a bit for it to trickle down. It may be so as a delayed triumph of the ulama, and while they now concentrate more on controlling women's sexuality and women's moves in general, there still is some continuity between the results of their doings in the colonial times and now. Thank you.
This is fantastic. I want to ask you a question that you mentioned, where you made a comparison with the abortion laws in Poland. So the term in Pakistan is used for such people, as you mentioned, Justice Munir, that they are liberal fascists, right? So, but the point is that only because an inappropriate or undemocratic method is adopted in order to provide something which is direly needed in society. In case of MFLO, there was need for reform, definitely. If Ayub Khan's coup had not happened, we had that report, right? Some reform was direly needed. So merely the fact that the reform actually came from the dictator, it should not, don't you think that it should not taint the reform in itself?
Well, good question. Of course, there's always the question. As I mentioned, when democracy comes back, it may take away of what we got from undemocratic regimes and we hold dear. Now the question is if we are to limit democracy, and if so, who is to limit and on whose behalf. Generally, I agree that some kind of law like MFLO was badly needed, but I am also of the opinion that being a part of an undemocratic program of progress, it marred the final result. Just similarly like the anti-democratic component of modernist Islam made this project quite unpopular. Actually, that can be seen even in the times of Ayub. When Ayub says that Maulana Maududi is the biggest enemy of Islam, so Maududi immediately gets far more followers than he could have got on his own right if he was left alone. When Ayub says that from Sufis we should not get the dance, we should not take the dances or the singing or the on the mystical cult of peers, but we should get the ethics of work and so on. So as part of the protests, young people actually choose those dance practice. Generally, when something is made us obey by undemocratic regimes, there's a natural tendency to do something different, and just maybe, the MFLO would have more impact if it was promulgated democratically. Of course, it would have met more problems on its way, but at least it would be harder to try to overturn it later. So that's the dividend which is being paid by democracy, which may not be the most effective of the policies, but in the long run, at least it's harder to do away with what it brings. But certainly, yeah.
Okay, so this is one last question. I think it was very interesting that you compared Ayub Khan's modernism with Taliban. So
it was not me, it was Muhammad Zaman.
Yes, so let's say Muhammad Zaman said, look, Taliban, so the similarity is that both are coercive, so they are not based on consent, right? But
right.
I think this is quite telling, because the looming return of Taliban, or the actual return of Taliban and their treatment of women, I am not really sure to what extent that analogy could be made. I think I would like you to comment on that, because one of the justifications for American invasion of Afghanistan, and specifically in the speech of Laura Bush, was that they are there to protect women. And now, after 20 years, they are leaving women, and the whole issue about women's rights and gender equality, which is, by the way, not even provided in American Constitution, because the 13th Amendment was not ever passed. So this kind of seems problematic, at least to me, that how the whole politics is actually played on women's bodies.
That's of course true, but I'm not saying I in any way endorse Taliban's agenda. But what Professor Zaman meant was more the undemocratic dimension of the way the Islam was pushed, and indeed we have innumerable examples of it from 1960s, or indeed from the times of Musharraf. Although he had to be more restrained because the militant Islam was more rampant at his times. But in Ayub's times we have numerous examples to silence the dissenting voices. Innumerable arrests of ulama or other critics of Ayub. trying to ban Jamaat-e-Islami or similar organizations. Or let's say accusations that Maududi is a fascist. So here we are. We have a dictator who who got to power by military takeover, who limited the democracy, who rules by ordinances, and yet still he is accusing others to be fascists. When the Government Institute of Islamic Research was at odds with Maududi and other ulama about, if I remember well, the date of Eid, Ayub was noting that those ulama are just disruptionists because they don't want any good for country. They are not about the faith, they are just about creating disruption. I don't think it was right. Yep. As I said, of course, the regime wasn't the Ayub regime wasn't making his politics using women's bodies to it. Although in a way it was, because the concession to women was also to find a long-lasting electorate for the Ayub's government. But still, there is something to be said for Professor Zaman comparison. It has its merits with all the differences.
This has been fascinating, Professor Filshinsky. And I want to ask you an unscholarly question. I just want to ask you about your surrounding. We heard some cockerel. So do you want to tell us where are you and what are you doing these days?
Okay. Here and now I'm in Uganda with my girlfriend.
Yeah.
Because the COVID lockdowns and other things made me stay a bit longer than I intended. In Poland, I'm affiliated with Polish Academy of Sciences Institute of History. There I'm trying to get financing which would allow the institute to hire me on. Make me hire there on a stable basis. And also, I'm trying to write the synthesis of history of Pakistan, which I mentioned. For now, I have only around 1,000 pages, but it will take around 5 more years to finish it. At my free time, I'm planning other projects. Also, the projects for, as it's called in Poland, habilitacja or habilitation in English, which would concern the British governors in Pakistan in the first years of its existence, because it's not a common knowledge that from the governors of 4 provinces during the times of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, 3 of them were British.
Wow.
And checking what brought those people there, what was their position in the state apparatus, and who were loyal to, would be a fascinating research question.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. Professor Filshinsky, you are doing wonderful work. So I don't have any more questions. So maybe Beta want to provide the concluding remarks or maybe more questions?
Yes, I mean, first of all, I want to say that, you know, when we first discussed the possibility of inviting here Dr. Tomasz, he actually asked how his work will fit in this what we're doing here in Global Institute of Law. He said that he's a historian, not a lawyer, and I also witnessed myself, you know, this kind of trend, I would say, amongst lawyers, in especially, I mean, in academic circles, that history is one discipline and law is another discipline. And of course, it's good to know the historical context of certain legal acts, but on the other hand, maybe it's not necessary. And to be honest, I would not agree with this statement. In my opinion, if you want to be a good historian, you don't need to be a lawyer. Sorry, that's my daughter. But for sure, if you want to be a good lawyer, then it's good if you are a good historian. And the historical interpretation, it's one of the tools. So yeah, please.
Let her come. Let's take her. She also wants to talk.
About women rights, so I'm a working mother, so I think it's okay.
Let's take her if she wants to say something, or yeah, it would be good.
I have just took her. For the next time, I promise maybe she will prepare some statement herself.
Okay.
She likes to talk a lot, so for sure we can learn something interesting from her. So what I was trying to say, that the historical interpretation is one of the tools in interpreting the law, and especially here in Pakistani setting, when we have very important and very vital regulation from the 19th and 20th century. It's very important, and it's very good to know the history of legislation of this act. So I think Dr. Flashinsky lecture today it was excellent, and it fit perfectly in the scope of Global Institute of Law is doing, and we learn a lot. We learn a lot, not only about the history, but we learn also about a lot about the law. And we touched here many important issues. And I think myself, I've never went really deep into history, unfortunately, but I learned many interesting things, and things which I had no idea about. So thank you so much, Dr. Flashinsky, for your lecture. It was an honor to have you here, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Flashinsky and Professor Bita for joining us. And have a good day.
Thank you. Good day too.
Thank you.